The Big Picture of the Bible, chapter 6. God's justice demands life as payment. Sin involves us in 3 deaths that influence our relationship with God and His universe. Death number 1, spiritual death, separation from the holy God who created us as a result of our own individual sin. Death number 2, mortal death, the death of our fleshly bodies, the result of Adam and Eve's first sin. But while spiritual and mortal death are consequences suffered by each individual, nothing has been done that would deal with sin. Nothing has been done to remove sin or restore man's spiritual relationship with God. That requires a 3rd kind of death, judicial death. There are prices to be paid when we break the laws of any country. For example, when we're caught speeding, we may be required to pay a fine as restitution. If we murder someone, we may be required to spend life in prison or may even be executed. These are penalties executed by our judicial system. They are the judicial price tag attached for the breaking of a law. Likewise, there is a judicial price that God requires as a legislative penalty for the breaking of His laws. The price God requires for sin is as serious as its consequences. The first command of God issued in the Garden of Eden clearly elaborated the judicial price for sin. In Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17, the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die." Put in the plainest of words, God pronounces the payment of death as the price for sin. This is the judicial price for breaking God's law. Life is the price. God pronounced death as the price for sin, and His justice must be served. Adam and Eve surely suffered the consequences of sin. They died spiritually the instant they sinned. And they were destined to eventually die a natural, mortal death many years later. But that did nothing to remove their sin or pay the price for their sin, death. The New Testament, in Hebrews 9, verse 22, clearly states the fundamental principle that without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins. God presented Adam and Eve with the choice to sin or not to sin. It was a choice they had control over. When tempted by Satan, they succumbed. Genesis 3, verse 6 describes it this way: "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband who was with her, and he ate." We all sin in this way at some point. In the New Testament book of James, James chapter 1, verse 14 and 15, it's described this way: Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. God demonstrated repeatedly throughout the Old Testament that the penalty for sin is the death of the sinner. It could not be put more plainly than it is in Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. The person who sins will die. Other examples include the Genesis flood, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and other things described in 2 Peter chapter 2. Peter reasons, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Death was a result of ungodliness throughout the Old Testament. God's mercy is already demonstrated to some extent in that we are not all immediately struck dead the instant we sin. That is what we deserve. But God takes no pleasure in the death of sinners. God does not have a bloodlust, nor is his justice administered carelessly. In Ezekiel 33 and verse 11, he says, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn back from your evil ways, for why will you die? God's desire is not that we die as a result of our rebellion against him. In summary, because of sin, the Old Testament introduces us to the language of death. Death number 1, spiritual death, the separation from God of our spirits due to our sin. Death number 2, mortal death, the death of our physical bodies as a result of the first sin of Adam and Eve. And death number 3, judicial death, the death that is required to pay the price for or atone for our sin. We are all pronounced guilty because we all have sinned. Looking over the scope of human history, the New Testament writers reflected this chilling and disturbing characteristic of man by observing that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We are in the most desperate of situations. We have broken the laws of the God of the universe. This has separated us from a holy God, and death is required for payment by this just God. If we die our natural, mortal death in this condition, we will be eternally separated from God. Another consequence of sin. If I could somehow give my life to pay this price, I would receive no benefit, as my life has ceased. No one else is qualified to pay this price for me, as they are liable for their own sins. What a wretched, miserable situation. Can I be delivered from this death sentence?